Okay. So good morning, everyone. Good evening, depending on your time zone. Uh, Welcome to the CFPR lunchtime seminar. It is my pleasure to welcome our speaker for today, Professor Shelley Clark. I know it's 10 p.m. in Montreal, right? So thank you for accommodating our schedule. Allow me to say a few words by way of introduction. Prof. Clark is a James McGill Professor of Sociology at McGill University. Her work examines family change, health, well-being, and life course transitions in North America and Africa. Her recent research agenda focuses on the well-being of children, of youth, as well as families in rural Canada and the US. And today she's going to share very interesting research. The title of her presentation is Rural Families During the Second Demographic Transition, Evidence from Canada and the United States. So, Prof. Shelley, I think you can speak for 40 minutes, and then we'll leave 20 minutes for Q&A, and then we try to finish at the top of the hour at 11 o'clock. So, Prof. Shelley, all yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for asking me to come and speak with you all and share some of this work. When Kriti first approached me and said, "Oh, we'd like you to come and talk, and we'd really like you to talk about what I've talked about for most of my academic career, which is around families in sub-Saharan Africa," and I said, "Well, I'd really love to do that, but in fact, I've turned my attention to focus on families in rural North America, so probably that isn't going to be that much of interest to your group. I don't know. We don't really sure." And she very politely said, "Yeah, well, maybe we'll take a pass on that." But then later on got back to me and said, "Well, actually, it might be an interest because, in fact, what we're finding in a lot of countries is that they are experiencing many of the characteristics of the second demographic transition, including in Asia. And in fact, we don't know that much though about what's going on in the rural parts of these countries, either in North America or in Europe or in Asia, where we know that nationally there's a lot of evidence of this second demographic transition happening, but we don't really know what's happening in rural areas. And so I think that I do really feel I'm excited about this research area, and I feel that there is a lot we can be learning by looking at some of these demographic and family changes from this rural and urban perspective. So maybe by the end of the talk, I'll convince some of you all that this is actually an interesting subject to be looking into in other places out in addition to the US and Canada. Okay, before I start, I also just want to acknowledge I'm going to do a bit of an overview of some of my work on this so far. So it's been done in various collaborations, primarily with one of my postdocs, Matthew Brooks, who is now an assistant professor at Florida State University, with my colleague Rachel Margolis, who's at Western University, and a PhD student of mine at McGill, Anne-Marie Halou. All right, so let me just, I'm not advancing for something. There we go. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about, let me first start off by trying to tell you all and convince you all why rural matters. Rural areas in most countries, including in Canada and the US, are the places that supply most of the food, the natural resources, and the energy for the country. In Canada, they are also home to 6 million Canadians, and in the US, rural areas are home to 60 million Americans. And in the US and Canada, our Indigenous populations are also more represented in rural areas. So in Canada, more than half of Canada's Indigenous population lives in what is designated as rural areas. Rural areas are also really important because they are often at the forefront of climate change and sort of feel the more immediate effects of climate change. And in many places, including in the US and in Canada, rural areas have really been undergoing very rapid economic changes. They've been transformed by things like economic restructuring, shifting from manufacturing mainly to sort of service industries, as well as these ongoing trends and forces of globalizations that have really affected rural economies. So all of this makes us wonder why we should care then specifically about rural families. Well, rural families, like all families, play this really important role in adapting to all of these political, social, and environmental and economic changes that are going on in rural areas. Also, as any family researcher knows, rural families largely determine the well-being of children, of youth, and also of care for older adults. Nonetheless, our knowledge about these rural families is very limited. Um, and often what we find is that many of our policies around education and health and social policies are often developed in urban areas and with urban families in mind. And many of these health and education social policies don't really work or aren't easily adapted to more rural settings. So I want to just start off and ask you all either in your own countries or your image what you know, which you probably do know some nowadays in the popular press about what rural families look like. How do we what do we think about what images pop to our mind when we think about rural families? And one of the things I think is really fascinating right now is that any of you who are paying attention at all to U.S. politics and U.S. elections will know that we are in the midst of a new political election. And in fact, we're in the middle right this very second of the Democratic National Convention, where just last night they nominated the new vice president for the Democratic Party, Tim Walz. And he stands really juxtaposed to the vice presidential candidate from the Republican Party, J.D. Vance. And what I think is interesting about this moment is that both of them are supposed to be representing rural lives and rural families. They were both specifically chosen for their tickets because of this appeal to rural images and rural families. But Waltz, or the Waltzes, as I sort of idealize them, have this very almost nostalgic, romanticized vision of these ideal rural families. These tend to be more traditional. They are based on marriage systems, close-knit families, often very large. They marry early and often. They have many children. And they typically unions are perceived to be as being more stable, and they're often surrounded by these large kinship networks. And as you see from this image here, these are not the waltzes, by the way. These are just images I have to illustrate this idea and this ideal of these sort of rural farm-based families in the United States. And this very much stands in contrast with another very common impression that we have about rural families, which is the impression that J.D. Vance puts forward. Both in J.D. Vance, of course, became famous. For those of you who are at all familiar, he wrote a book that became a national bestseller and a Oscar award a movie called Hillbilly Elegy. But what's important about that book is that the subtitle is A Memoir of a Family and a Culture in Crisis. And that one of the main points of this book is that his view is that families, especially rural families, are in a state of crisis. And the image he portrays, and the image that we see not just from him, but from a lot of media attention in the US, is that in fact, rather than this sort of wholesome traditional rural family that is epitomized sort of by this Waltz image, we think of rural families actually as being very dysfunctional, often violent, high levels of teen pregnancy, shotgun weddings, cohabitation, or in rural areas, what they refer to as shacking up. Lots of domestic violence and many households headed by parents. So what I want to just start off by saying is that this idea, these contrasting simultaneous images that we as North Americans and especially as Americans hold about rural families is still very present with us. And of course, you're going to ask me, well, which of these images is true? And I'm going to tell you, well, of course, neither in both of these images is true. Just like you could find in urban families, you're going to find families that are very functional and large and have large stable marriages and lots of kids. And you're also going to find families that are not particularly stable and have high levels of single parenthood, grandparent-led households, etc. But of course, as family demographers, what we really care about is what's going on average, what are the trends, what are the patterns, how can we really actually understand what actually might be going on and affecting not just one particular family, but more broadly rural families as a whole. And of course, that's where we step in with this research. So one of the main questions that I'm interested in is, we know that these changes are going on with the second demographic transition. I suspect most of the people here know what the second demographic transition is, but just quickly, there are many aspects of this second demographic transition. Probably the most central one is that this is a transition where we go not just from replacement fertility of 2.1 kids, but to below replacement fertility. So very low levels of fertility. Other characteristics of the second demographic transition is that we have increased family diversity in the structure of families. And this can mean all sorts of different things, but it very often means rising levels of people who never marry and rising levels of people who cohabit and live in cohabiting unions rather than in marriages. And then lastly, and somewhat related, particularly to the second one, is that during the second demographic transition, we see a growing proportion of children who are being born and raised outside of marriage. So it's this decoupling of marriage and parenthood that happens during the second demographic transition. And so one of the main things I'm going to be looking at is what is happening. Are rural families actually experiencing these changes as well? Because we know that urban families in most high income countries, in fact, in practically all high income countries, are. But before I go to the second demographic transition, I want to take a little detour and talk first about the first demographic transition, what most of us just refer to as the demographic transition, because for that first transition, for the classic demographic transition theory, this contrast between rural and urban families was absolutely central to understanding what was going on in that first demographic transition theory. So usually demographers attribute the demographic transition theory to Nodstein in the mid 1900s. And broadly speaking, the idea is just that social economic change associated with industrialization induced change from very high to low fertility. That's it in its nuts and bolts. But if you really read Nodstein, Nodstein really talks about the urban industrial society, and he makes a big deal about contrasting both the economic structures and the social structures in rural and urban areas as explaining why the demographic transition first occurred. So really, he's talking about the shift from a rural livelihood that was mainly based on agriculture, where having lots of kids was great for the production of the farm, and you wanted to marry early and have lots of kids, and they all helped out on the family farm, versus this factory work where it was wage based, was based on individuals and how much an individual earned, and that you really didn't have as much incentive to have as many children. He also interestingly talks a lot about differences in social norms between rural and urban areas. And he talks about how in rural areas there was just much more surveillance on demographic and family behaviors. So what we find is that families and neighbors would apply a considerable amount of pressure to get married and have children, whereas in the cities you could get away with a lot more anonymity. That is, you could, if you decided not to marry, you decide to live on your own, you decide not to have a kid or to have fewer children, that we received less surveillance and sanction for making those choices. So really what I think what's interesting is Nodstein really, if you go back and read the original um, research of his, he really talks a lot about these social and economic differences in rural and urban areas as explaining the first demographic transition. And his basic argument was fertility, marriage, going to stay high in rural areas. It's going to be lower in urban areas. And by and large, that was true. Now, of course, a little later on, what we find is that the ideational diffusion people come along and they say, well, it's not that, sort of fertility is going to remain indefinitely high in rural areas. Eventually, ideas are going to spread. They're going to spread from this urban core to this rural periphery. And eventually, fertility rates are also going to start to fall in rural areas. But what's key to even the ideational diffusion people is that, yes, fertility would eventually fall in rural areas, but it would still lag behind urban areas. Fertility, according to them, would always be lower in urban areas than in rural areas. So that was fairly clear about what the expectations were in the first demographic transition. And by and large, across a multitude of countries that underwent the first demographic transition, that has held true, that has been empirically borne out. But really, we don't know whether or not it is still true for the second demographic transition. That is it still true with these new changes that we're seeing in family structures and fertility, that rural areas still, quote, lag behind urban areas? So there are three main competing hypotheses about this. One, of course, is the original people who, Lethgate and Vandekar, who thought about and came up with the term the second demographic transition, really focused on this ideological change. And they said the reason we're seeing this shift to super low fertility and to low marriage and higher cohabitation, et cetera, is because there's been an ideological shift. People shifted away from this more community, religious kind of norms into individualism and secularism. And of course, we know that in general, rural areas tend to be more religious, they tend to be more community oriented. And so, if in fact the main driver of this second demographic transition are these shifts in ideological change, then we would hypothesize that you would continue to see these persistent differences in rural and urban areas, that rural areas would in fact continue to lag behind urban areas, and urban areas would be more likely to have lower fertility and have, more kids outside of marriage and less, more cohabitation. Rural scholars, however, interestingly, would not think that that would be the case. One thing that rural scholars point out is that, this sort of, rural urban divide, we make a big deal about it, but in fact, especially over the last 2, 3 decades, there's been a lot of social economic integration between rural and urban areas. There's been a lot of mobility. People easily drive into the city now. They have, Zoom calls where we can talk halfway around the world. We're not so isolated and separated anymore, and so rural and urban areas have become more similar, according to rural scholars, and hence they might actually hypothesize that rural and urban families might become more similar, that they might actually start engaging in more similar types of family behaviors. And then the last hypothesis are the researchers who have looked at the second demographic transition, and they disagree with the argument that it's driven mainly by ideological change. And they say, really, what's driving cohabitation, non-marital childbirth, is not a shift away from religion or away from community or a different value of independence or self-actualization. What it really is that a lot of these people, particularly these women, come from lower incomes, lower educational backgrounds. And even though they want to get married and they want to have kids, they can't really afford to achieve these goals. And as a result, what's really driving these changes in the second demographic transition is actually lower SES. And what's interesting is if you actually apply that to a rural area, it actually would suggest that you're going to see that rural areas, far from lagging behind urban areas, might actually be sort of leading the second demographic transition, because overall rural areas have lower levels of education and lower levels of income. So we really have these three different competing hypotheses about what might be happening to rural families relative to urban families, and not a whole lot of data to really tell us what's happening. So obviously, our first research question is to simply say, okay, so what has happened? How have rural and urban families changed in the US over the last 30 years? I'm then going to look at, given current differences, the ways in which rural and urban families are different right now, what is explaining those differences? What's driving those differences? Is it differences in religion and ideation? Is it differences in SES? Is it differences in the demographic composition of the population? And then lastly, I'll look a little bit at some of the implications of this work and family change for the living situations of children. And of course, the reason we care about that is we know that children's living arrangements, who they live with in their household, has a lot to do with child poverty. And there's a very close association between the living arrangements of kids and child poverty. And so we're going to look at some of the implications for that. And for those results, I'll focus just on the US. Okay, so on to our first question. How have rural and urban families changed over the past 30 years? For this question, I'm going to look at data from the Canadian General Social Survey starting in 1990 and going to 2017. I'm going to look at a roughly similar time span in the US using the National Survey of Family Growth data. Um, And I'm going to look at this entire span in order to look at trends. And then when I compare current differences, I'll focus just on those two last years of 2017 and 2018. And in all of my analyses, I'm limiting it to women age 15 to 44. I'm going to look at three main outcomes. I'm going to look at differences in women's union status, whether they're married, cohabiting, never married, or formerly married. I'm going to look at the number of children the women have, and also the proportion of births that are outside of marriage. And all of this is just basic descriptive, weighted percentages, and means. Okay, so to look at this the first outcome here, which is women's union status, we find, typical of the second demographic transition, there is this so-called retreat from marriage in both the US and Canada. But what we do see is that this retreat has been steeper in rural areas here in the green than it has been in urban areas. So it's fallen in both countries, in both places, but it's been even steeper in rural than in urban areas. So it definitely used to be the case that we saw that rural women were more likely to be married than urban women, but that's no longer the case in either country. What really has been a very big and somewhat unexpected change is that rural women are now significantly more likely than urban women to cohabit, to be in a cohabiting relationship. And that's true in both Canada and in the US. So here we are actually seeing divergence where rural women are engaging in more of this characteristic of the second demographic transition than are urban women. Formerly married women are fairly similar in both places and have changed roughly the same. And there's been somewhat of a convergence in the percentage of never married women in both Canada and the US in rural and urban areas. In terms of number of kids, we see very different patterns happening in Canada and the US. In the US, yes, we used to see higher fertility among rural women than urban women, but now this difference has shrunk quite considerably. And in fact, this difference of 1.15 kids versus 1.108 kids is no longer statistically significant. In Canada, however, there is a very large difference. It starts off as being basically rural women are having half a kid more almost, and by the end they're having 0.6 of a kid more than are urban women. And for people who study fertility, that's a fairly large average difference in fertility rates in rural and urban areas, and we don't really see any evidence of convergence whatsoever in Canada in the number of kids. However, in both the US and Canada, more of these kids in rural areas are now being born outside of marriage. So we see that in both Canada and the US now, rural kids are 10 percentage points more likely than their urban counterparts to be born outside of marriage. And you can see in Canada, this just shows clear divergence over time where rural areas are kind of taking the lead here on non-marital fertility. Whereas in the US, you actually see a switching where it used to be less common in rural areas and now it's more common in rural areas. Okay, so to briefly summarize these results, what we find is that in general, there is evidence of a fair amount of convergence across some forms of particularly marital patterns. The one place where we find evidence of persistence is with respect to the number of kids, but that's just in Canada, where we see rural areas are still, quote, lagging behind. They're still having more kids than the urban areas. And then we see these interesting patterns of divergence with respect to cohabitation and non-marital childbearing in both the US and Canada. So in this next part, I'm going to focus just on those outcomes in green, where we see significant differences in rural and urban areas to try to understand what's driving those differences. So the next research question obviously is what is driving these differences in these rural behaviors, looking just at cohabitation, number of kids, and non-marital births. Obviously, I'm mainly going to be focusing on rural and urban differences, but importantly here, I'm going to control for differences in the demographic composition of rural and urban areas, both their age, race and ethnicity, immigrant status, social economic status, and also religiosity, which I'll measure here as how frequently they attend religious services. Very quickly, just to show you that there are in fact differences, particularly with respect to demographic characteristics. What probably wouldn't surprise that many people is that rural areas are less ethnically, racially diverse than our urban areas. What I think is a little bit surprising to me, is just how much starker that difference is in Canada than it is in the US. So in Canada, we see, for example, that 30% of the urban population is a firstborn immigrant, compared to only 7% in rural areas. Whereas in the U.S., it is also true that a higher percentage of the urban population are immigrants, 15, but still, we find that 10% of the rural population are immigrants, and that difference is not statistically significant. Similarly, there are just very big differences in racial ethnic representation in rural areas in Canada. There are also quite large differences in the US, but they're not quite as large. There are also big differences in social economic characteristics. In particular, in both Canada and in the US, we see that rural women are far more that urban women are far more likely than rural women to have a bachelor's degree, to have a college degree. And that pattern is pretty consistent in both countries. Interestingly, there aren't huge differences in income in Canada in rural and urban areas, but there are pretty substantial differences in income in the US, with urban women being earning far higher incomes than rural women. And then lastly, despite all this attention to the fact that we think that there's higher levels of religiosity in rural areas, we really don't find any evidence of that in either Canada or the US. In terms of how often people go to church services, it's actually fairly similar in both rural and urban areas. Okay. So the question then is, so if we adjust for all those differences in demographic factors, in SES, and in religiosity, does that then explain these differences in cohabitation and childbirth and non-marital fertility? And what we can see here is, for cohabitation, I mean, it reduces the coefficient in both countries a bit, but it doesn't fully explain it. It still remains statistically significant. For births in Canada, we see that, again, controlling for all of those factors reduces the difference from 0.6 of a child to 0.5 of a child. So really, it's not really the demographics, religiosity, SES are not really explaining very much. Where it does have some explanatory powers with respect to non-marital births. So here we find in both countries, whereas there was a statistically significant difference with rural areas having more non-marital births, once we adjust for all of those factors, that effect becomes statistically insignificant. So to look more closely at what may actually be driving these differences, or helping to explain some of these, if we look at cohabitation for women, we find again some very interesting differences, but in the Canada and the US. In Canada, we see that it is mainly the reason that rural women are less likely are more likely to cohabit than urban women is because they have fewer immigrants and they have less racial and ethnic diversity. And this is actually really interesting because, of course, the immigrant and ethnic composition in Canada is very different than in the US. There's actually a very high fraction of the Canadian immigrant and ethnic population that's from Asia, where cohabitation is not all that common. And so actually, this has a lot more to do with cultural practices of immigrant and racial groups and ethnic groups than it does of other factors. Whereas in the US, we see that it has nothing to do with racial and ethnic differences, but it actually has to do with the lower household incomes and the fact that rural households tend to be poorer, that is driving higher levels of cohabitation in rural areas. So even though we see similar patterns, the reasons for these patterns are actually quite different by country. If we look at number of kids in Canada, we see that not a whole lot, as I said, actually does explain this. Only 21% of the difference is explained, but that part that is explained is a little bit explained by differences in race and ethnicity, and is mainly explained by lower levels of education among rural women in Canada. And then Lastly, if we look at the composition effects for non-marital childbirth, we see that the reason for higher non-marital childbirth in rural Canada has to do both with the fact that there are fewer immigrants and with their lower education levels, whereas in the US, it's purely SES. It is both because these women have lower education and they have lower incomes that's driving these non-marital births in rural parts of the US. Okay, so on to our third research question. Just to look a little bit at some of the implications of this family change, both for how kids are growing up. We know how they're born. We know whether or not mom's married at the time of their birth, but that doesn't say much about the families that they're actually raised in, and how that then affects child poverty rates in rural and urban areas. So these are some very descriptive, but I think they're kind of interesting analyses of the living arrangements of kids 0 to 17 in non-metropolitan, which is rural, and metropolitan parts of the US. And what we can see here is that in both non-metropolitan and metropolitan areas, over time, we see a decline in the proportion of kids who are living in two-parent married households, although that still is the most common type of living arrangement for kids. Um, but what we see is that in general, by 2020, 21, 22, we see that now again, more urban kids are likely to live with married parents than are rural kids. And if we look then down below at the details of, okay, if they're not living with married parents, who are they living with? We can see, for example, that again, cohabitation, which is this line with the square here, has risen very sharply in rural areas and is now higher than cohabitation in urban areas. Again, cohabitation's gone up in both, but it's just gone up a lot more in rural areas. So you see more rural kids living with cohabiting rather than married parents. We also see in both places that the proportion of kids living with a formerly married parent, that is a parent who's divorced or separated or widowed, has declined over time as divorce rates have gone down. But that this decline has actually been steeper in urban areas, leaving more rural kids living with a single formerly divorced or widowed parent. And then this bottom line here, I think, is especially worthy of note, because what we see here is that rural kids are also far more likely to be what we call it to be in kinship care. These are kids who are not living with any parent. So they could be living with an aunt or an uncle or a cousin or someone like that, but they're not living with any parent in the household. And we see that that's substantially higher in rural areas than in urban areas. If we look at this a little further, and again, this harkens back to this sort of these two images we have of rural families, what we see is that there's actually a lot of variation in family formation and rural urban differences by regions in the US. So if we look at where Tim, Waltz is from the Midwest, we actually don't see all that much difference in the proportion of rural and urban kids who are living with two married parent families, nor that big of a difference, even in something such as if they're not living with married parents, they're more likely to be in cohabiting parents. They're not all that likely to be living with single or formerly married parents. Um, and that's true in the Northeast. That's also true a bit in the West, where we really see these very stark differences in rural and urban kids' living arrangements is in the Southeast and in the Southwest. So if we look here, you can see that rural kids in the Southwest are substantially less likely than urban kids in the Southwest to be with married parents. Here you can also see these very big differences in the proportion of rural kids in the Southeast who are in kinship care compared to urban kids, and very similar patterns that we find in the Southwest as well, where you see these really sharp dichotomies between rural and urban families in those regions that are much less pronounced in the Northeast, the Midwest, and in the West, although some of those patterns exist. Okay, so in general, we see that if we just look, this is a more simplified version of some of these data. If we just look over time, we see that the proportion of kids not living in married households in rural areas has risen from 25% to 35%, whereas in urban areas, it's only risen by 3 percentage points from 28% to 31%. Why do we care? We care because who these kids live with is very closely associated with childhood poverty. So these are rates of childhood poverty broken down by living arrangements in rural and urban. And what you can see is that kids living with married parents have the lowest levels of child poverty, whereas kids living with never married parents, typically single moms here, have really quite high levels of poverty, with 41% of rural kids and 35% of urban kids living with single parents who live in poverty, compared to only 6% of rural kids and 10% of urban kids with married parents living in poverty. And then kids in cohabiting households do somewhere in the middle, and formerly marrieds also are kind of somewhere in between, the sort of poverty levels of never marrieds and married parents. So for our last question, we look at the supplemental poverty measure for kids, which is a better measure than our official poverty measures, because it takes into account transfers from the governments and also differences in cost of living, which can be quite dramatic in rural and urban areas. And we look at as our main outcome, sort of how levels of child poverty vary by children's living arrangements and urban and rural areas. And then we interact rural residents with be living in an unmarried parent household to see whether or not this penalty for not living in a married couple, or as some people recently referred to it as, the marriage bonus for kids. If you are living with married parents, you tend to be much less likely to live in poverty, but to see whether or not that's actually stronger in rural areas. We control again for a bunch of demographic characteristics of, as well as the SES and the region where these kids are living, because we do see these big regional differences. And this is what we find. We find again that that in both rural and urban areas, kids who are living with married parents are less likely to live in poverty than those who are not living with married parents. But what we clearly see here is that there's a very strong and significantly bigger difference. There's a bigger penalty for not living with them in a married household in rural areas than in an urban area. But what I think is additionally interesting is, if you really look at this, the penalty is not so much that rural kids have a greater penalty for living with unmarried parents. In fact, it's about 16% of rural kids compared to 17% of urban kids, but rather that the marriage bonus, the protective factor of living with married parents, is much stronger in rural areas, where we see these really quite low, relatively low rates of poverty among kids living with married parents in rural areas compared to urban kids with married parents. All right. So to sum up, because I know I've covered a lot of ground here, I've been working on this as sort of a bigger project for a while. It is important to note that the second demographic transition is unfolding differently in rural and urban parts of North America. In some respects, rural areas are actually ahead of urban areas, particularly because they have higher rates of cohabitation, non-marital fertility, fewer children raised by married parents, and one might note, fewer children living in two parent married households. Um, but the one exception here is that in Canada, fertility remains much higher in rural areas. And I think this is interesting, and is one of the areas I'm trying to work on now to figure out why. Nonetheless, the reasons driving these trends in the US and Canada are very different. In the US, it's mainly because of lower education and income in rural areas. That is, it sort of supports this SES, or this disadvantage hypotheses. But in Canada, it's really because there's less ethnic diversity and in particular fewer immigrants. So it really has to do more with cultural differences, which are not necessarily ideological differences, but rather cultural differences based on place of origin. And then why fertility remains so much higher in rural Canada remains a mystery that I'm working on. I'll let you know soon. Okay. Takeaway message number 3 is that rural kids are increasingly likely to be raised by single or cohabiting parents. Children, these living arrangements have higher levels of poverty, but the penalty for living with unmarried parents is stronger in rural areas. But this is mainly because marriage confers significantly more protection for rural children. So, in conclusion, I'm just sort of going to recap my arguments for why I think studying rural families can help. I do think it helps family demographers better understand the drivers of family change and also geographic inequalities in types of family formation. I also think it's useful for rural scholars because who typically study things like rural communities and rural economies to understand the role and the interactions with family structures that are affecting these rural economies and communities. A lot of this work I'm trying to communicate with policymakers to help them understand that we might need to develop better social, educational, and health policies to meet the evolving needs of rural families and to really understand their diversity and complexity. And also to communicate with the media and to the public so that they have a more complete picture of rural families today instead of these more stylized and stereotypical images, which are often portrayed in the media. So that is everything for now. Thank you very much. I thank you so much for your attention and also for the funding that supported this work from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Shelley. I see a hand raised up already. Mutsen, you want to start us off with Q&A?
Hi. Professor Clark, thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I'm a colleague of Vincent and Kriti. And so, yeah, I saw that you have showed that both like cultural factors as well as socioeconomic factors are important, and they tend to play out very differently in the two contexts. I actually have a question about the potential interaction of the two factors. And so it is likely that, for example, those like minority groups with higher education, and they may have a stronger tendency, for example, to assimilate to the modern, right, to the cosmopolitan. And so I just recalled like a recent finding based in the United States, and actually showing that, for example, for university educated Black women, they tend to have the lowest fertility levels because they want to overcorrect these stereotypes that they tend to be the most pronatal, and they want to show their cosmopolitan temperaments. And so in that case, it is likely, so for example, for immigrants of like a better educational and socioeconomic backgrounds in the first place, they are more likely to be attracted to metropolitan areas, and also they tend to assimilate better, right, into the modern lifestyles overall. And that's in a way, I think the possibility is that actually the influences of culture might be moderated by their socioeconomic status. Yeah, so I want to listen to your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right, and it's a really fascinating question that I think I'm currently working on a paper that is trying to break down more about family structures around sort of race, region, and rurality, and looking at that also by a socioeconomic gradient would be very interesting because you know, I mean, you're absolutely right that there's a lot of people's behaviors that are going to reflect both their ethnicity, but also their social economic status, right? And that you might actually find behaviors that are even more pronounced in terms of being, the very highly educated who maybe they don't even get married at all. Maybe they don't have any kids because they're really committed to a career or committed to climbing a sort of social economic status ladder or holding on to it in a way that might not be as important. And I think one area that'd be super interesting to look at it, and where I think we would have a large enough sample, are both. There actually is a very large population of rural African Americans in the Southeast in the US, and there's actually a very large population of Hispanics, rural Hispanics in the Southwest of the US. And looking at that interaction to see, like, does fitting in mean that you are much more likely, as you become higher SES, to reduce fertility in these urban contexts than in these rural contexts? So I think it's a fascinating question. I don't have an answer to you, but I think it's definitely worth looking into some more.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yansu, do you have a question?
Oh, hi. Sorry, I thought I can type in, but I think I can.
It's okay. I think you can just pose it. Yeah.
communicate.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay. So, thank you for really wonderful presentation. And as Professor Clark, you just mentioned that you have been studying like the families in South Africa. So I'm thinking about, like, have you seen like any significant differences among like different like countries, like for example between like North America and then North America and South Africa? Because we know, like, generally the income, we have a really big income differences between these like states. So I wonder if there are any significant differences you ever seen in the research.
Yeah, I mean, I really like studying them in both contexts, and I have done some work specifically in South Africa, but mainly like across sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that there are very and I've worked in sub-Saharan Africa in both rural and urban contexts. And actually, one of the reasons that motivated me to work on rural stuff in North America is I actually typed in like rural families, and there's way more work on rural families in like Malawi or in rural China than there is in North America, right? And so in many ways, I actually think work on rural families has been much more a focus in sub-Saharan Africa than it has been in North America. And even comparing like fertility rates and marriage rates and between rural and urban areas. And I have done a fair amount of work in sub-Saharan Africa looking at some of those differences. But most countries in sub-Saharan Africa aren't quite yet entering into the second demographic transition. They're still having this, overall decline in fertility rates, but it's not below fertility rate levels. And I mean, it's interesting in sub-Saharan Africa because we act like cohabitation is this like big modern invention, but of course in sub-Saharan Africa, most marriages are not formally legally registered in a civil union anyway. So it depends what you mean by cohabitation. But we do see some evidence that cohabitation, for example, is on the rise across sub-Saharan Africa, and that but but it is a very different context, because something like, for example, non-marital fertility rates also in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa have traditionally been very high, and if anything are actually declining right now, as like this sort of embracing of marriage and of this kind of order of transitions to adulthood where you get married first and then you have kids is becoming more normalized. So I think it's very hard to actually compare the two contexts, but I think there's a lot of interesting change that's happening in both places. But I don't think right now parts of sub-Saharan Africa are very well captured by concepts of the second demographic transition. I think there are other regions of the world that, you know, one could apply those ideas to, and where you see those behaviors, but Sub-Saharan Africa is not really one of them at the moment.
Okay, thank
Thank
you.
you. I see a question here by Sorav Model. You want to pose your question? Okay, if not, Kriti, you want to pose your
Yes,
question?
yes. Thank you so much, Shelley. That was a fascinating talk. Enjoyed it immensely. I was wondering, and I'm not that familiar with the kind of childcare provisions that are provided by Canada or baby bonuses. I'm wondering if, as you are comparing the two contexts, I think there may be big differences across the two contexts in the provision of support provided by the state. And I wonder if you have looked into examining those differentials.
Yeah, so there are differentials both in policies around fertility as well as policies around marriage and cohabitation, right? So so Quebec, which is where I live, we actually have a fascinating true like well we have one of the and arguably the highest rates of cohabitation in the world. We exceed most, you know, Sweden and other like Nordic countries. More than half of the children in Quebec are born, quote, you know, outside of marriage, but most of them are in cohabiting couples. And Quebec has also been very progressive and led things like, you know, we had this infamous $7 a day daycare. It was, you know, this very cheap, heavily subsidized childcare, fairly generous parental leave policies. Some of those policies have very recently, but you know, even now they're kind of in an awkward rollout phase. So over the last couple of years, but not all provinces still have them, been more broadly adopted across Canada. But prior to that rollout, Quebec really stands out as an anomaly, but otherwise a lot of both the fertility and the and the marriage and cohabitation policies in quote the rest of Canada looks a lot like the US actually. I mean, there's also variation across all the states in the US too, but there's not that much difference. So it really, the data that I'm looking at there's not actually enormous differences in the types of specific family policies. There are bigger differences in broader social policies around like healthcare access, for example. Canada has had for a long time universal access to healthcare, whereas the US system is not that. It's moving in that direction, but still not that. So, you know, you could think that that too could affect like general senses of economic security and questions like that that could come into play. But the exact family policies haven't actually until recently been all that different, except for Quebec, which has been it's been fascinating to be living and working here because they really have gone on their own kind of path with respect to both family policies and these measures of the second demographic transition. Yeah.
Thank you. I have also a follow-up question. So when we are if we could go back to your slide, which is talking about fertility rates and it's comparing US and Canada fertility rates by urban rural differences. I thought it was really interesting that in Canada, I remember seeing that there was a bigger gap.
Right.
And so I was thinking could, again, related to the support, could the support provided by the state have higher returns in rural areas?
Right. Yeah, I don't know I mean, this is a research question that is like high on my priority to try to delve into a bit more. I think I don't know why. You know, why is it that in rural Canada you see these really fairly exceptionally high levels of fertility, and you really, and you used to in the US, but you don't anymore. So one argument could be, as you suggest, that there's more support. So, you know, even just greater access to daycare, making it more affordable could play a big difference. It might also be, one of the big differences you do see is that the income gap is just not that large in Canada. So it really just might be more affordable in Canada in rural areas. I mean, we generally in Canada don't find these kind of deep pockets of poverty in rural areas the way that you do in the US. So that could definitely play a role in some of this. But I truly don't know. I truly think that this is something that, you know, for any of the governments that are concerned or interested in, like, how do we boost fertility or how do we stop it from falling so fast, we should be trying to understand what is happening in rural areas that is enabling them to have this many kids. You know, so yeah, I wish I had an answer, and maybe I will in like 6 or 7 months, because it's I'm looking at some new data to look at it, but I don't. It's a mystery.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. When you have the answer, we'd like to have it. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Shelley.
Any last questions?
Do you want me to answer? I see there is one in the
Yeah, if you
in
could,
the
yes,
chat.
if you could,
Do you want
yeah.
me to quickly
Yep,
just
yep, if
yeah,
you
so
could,
these
yeah.
are really this is a really interesting debate about the second demographic transition that there's been a lot of research arguing these two sides, really arguing, you know, this kind of notion that it's individualism and people with higher education who are in the avant-garde and, you know, are embracing these non-marital norms and not having kids, and you know, which is sort of traditionally what we think of as the ideational change theories for the second demographic transition theory. And then there's a lot of critiques of that say, no, actually what we see is higher levels of cohabitation and non-marital childbearing, in particular among women of lower education and lower SES, and empirically, you know, there's really great qualitative research around this where they ask women, particularly low income women in the US, hey, why aren't you getting married? And they just say, basically, I can't afford it, or I can't find a partner, or I'm not able to sort of have that kind of, you know, opportunity to have that kind of financial stability. And I want the financial stability first before I would enter into a marriage. And there's also some really good work. So it's not just in the US that we actually find higher cohabitation and non-marital childbearing among less educated women and women with lower SES, but actually across Europe too. There's some really good work coming out of Southampton that shows that, in particular, you know, as your education level goes up, you are less likely to have kids outside of marriage. You still prefer more educated women still prefer to have kids inside of marriage, and the argument, and again qualitative data saying that it's not, when you talk to women with less education, it's not that they say, oh yeah, I just really wanted to have a kid without getting married. They think that they say they can't afford it, right? And so that's really this argument of social economic disadvantage that's actually making marriage and having kids within marriage unaffordable. There's also some work that shows that women with college degrees, for example, are more likely to stay in a marriage. They have more stable unions than women who don't have a college degree. And again, this relates to the kind of financial strain that happens, and puts strain on the relationship when you're experiencing financial strain. You know, so it's not this ideological shift of, oh, I'm rejecting marriage. It's really just making marriage and keeping long-term stable marriages less feasible for people. So so that's the, in a nutshell, that's the kind of one of the big arguments that's happening around explaining, you know, we see these trends, but then what's really causing them? And there's a fair amount of ongoing debate around that right now.
Okay. Could I just ask one question? And then we end this call. I find it interesting that the way you sort of argued the case in this research is that to say that rural Canada is exceptional, right? For the fact that they have more children. would it be helpful to actually look at it sort of the other way, to say that the low fertility in rural America is in fact the exception that needs to be explained, and might the I don't know, might the answer sort of change if you pose the question on the side of the US for its low fertility instead of Canada's high fertility in the rural areas.
I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it and framing it. And again, trying to understand, is it the case that in rural areas, is that gap, let's say, between the ideal number of kids they're having and the actual kids they're having, might that actually be larger in rural US than it is in rural Canada, right? And even larger than in urban US, right? It might be that in urban US, they actually want to have fewer kids. In rural areas, they actually want to have more kids. But again, they're not able to obtain that, right? For whatever reason, which really could have a lot to do with a lot of the economic shocks that have been going on in rural areas and have been really hard hit in the US. So I think that's a really interesting framing of that question. And I promise, as soon as I know more about what's going on, I'll see whether or not, in fact, it's the case everywhere that rural fertility remains much higher. It's just the US that's exceptional. Yeah, it's a great idea.
Yeah. I therefore agree with Kriti when she says that it's the policy environment. The policy environment is very different in the US and Canada, and that might create differences in fertility decisions and so on. But could I just squeeze in one more point? The whether it is cultural or socio-economic, I think that's a very interesting question. I'm just wondering whether you could sort of try to tease this out and pass this out by looking at the relationship between urban, rural, on number of children by region, because there are regional variations in culture and regional variations in socio-economic conditions. So, for example, in Canada, you have you can contrast Quebec with Ontario, British Columbia, and so on. And there are variations at the regional level, you see, with SES as well as culture. And might that actually give a hint, as to which of the two, or whether it's a combination of both that's actually driving the pattern for Canada. Yeah.
Yeah, I as I said, I am starting, mainly in the US, but it's true for Canada too, right? Is that the region and morality overlap a great deal, right? And so figuring out whether or not there are bigger gaps in some regions than in other regions, or if in fact it just happens to be that the Midwest is more rural, so that's why we're seeing this, so that also is on my future research question. So stay tuned.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Prof. Shelley, for taking time to speak with us and to share with us your research. It's past 11, and I'm aware it's evening on your side. So I wish everybody a good weekend ahead, and see you again for our next seminar. Thank you so much. Thanks, Prof. Shelley. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Clark.